Hello everyone, I'm Christina Lesmondena from the University of Hull, and I'm going to do a small podcast because unfortunately I can't be there for personal reasons, and I hope you're having a nice conference. I'm sure you are, and say hello particularly for Heinrich obviously, and wish him very much all the best. What I'd like to do is in a few minutes in this podcast just to go through a few of the ideas I would have liked to have explored there. I've got a paper, the last paper I've done, which explores some of these ideas, and so hopefully Elena will have made those available to you also. But I'm going to look at my notes every so often, so please bear with me. But what I like to do is really look at representation from a parliamentary perspective, so parliamentary representation in our context today of 21st century. Because my argument is that we have many new developments that don't necessarily allow us to understand parliamentary representation as we have it today. We still very much use the same framework of the 19th century and the same conceptual tools that have been developed throughout the 20th century, and which turn very much around the idea of a delegation model. We elect representatives for 4 or 5 years. Within that period, they act for us, and there's a discussion of, do they act in our best interest, do they defend their interests, do they use their judgment, a variety of questions. Which a lot of those discussions are very much about to what extent are those representatives like us, and are they serving us well. And my argument is that in the society of today we need to change that slightly. We need to not necessarily ignore that, that's still very important, but add a new dimension to that. And so what I would like to do is, first of all, just to highlight the key changes which I think have affected the way we look at parliamentary representation, and then finish with maybe how we should rethink in terms of our conceptual tools in parliamentary studies and the way we look at parliamentary representation. So there are, in my view, there's plenty, but there's 4 key changes really that have changed the way we have parliamentary representation today, or the way it's performed today in terms of the role that parliament plays in society. And these 4 key changes are changes in our society in terms of social demographics, who we are and how we access information, that sort of thing. Technological changes in terms of the rise of the internet and the accessibility of information, but also what the internet allows us to do in terms of participating and accessing information. The development of a huge expansion of participatory tools, so tools and opportunities to participate directly into politics at different levels, beyond or in parallel the representative institutions. And then finally, the specialisation of politics, which is obviously a topic that has been developed throughout the 20th century. It's not new, it's just become even more so. So I'll start with that one. The specialisation and the complexification of politics. More and more, increasingly, we have many institutions, many different bodies dealing with politics. The idea that we have, a parliament of say 200 or 600 representatives, together with the ministries in government dealing with these issues, that's a very old-fashioned view. In reality, as we all know, there's many more bodies and institutions involved with that, from different levels, super level and subnational level, but also judicial institutions, ombudsman, pressure groups, monitoring groups. There's so many different players and institutions going into the whole equation, and all of that affects the way parliamentary representation is understood and the role it can perform in terms of linking the citizen and the representatives. We also have today very different type of citizens. Our access to information is much higher, but particularly our access to education is much higher. So we are much better informed, and we also have the tools to understand that information, but also to critically judge those and make our own judgments. Picking up on Pippa Norris' terms, we are very much today the critical citizens. So we may receive information, whereas before, say in the 1950s, we would see that information and not do very much with that. Today, we will listen to that information, critique it according to our own views and our own needs and interests. And that makes the monopoly of representation much more in doubt, because we all have a view. So I might have a representative with very specific views on, say, for instance, matters that matter a lot to me, which is, say, dyslexia, because one of my sons got dyslexia. and they may have lots and lots of information, lots of reports, etc. But ultimately, I'll have my own views because I also have access to lots of different information, and I can also form my own opinions. So there's a questioning there of the representative mandate that may not necessarily have happened as much before. Linked to this, very much the development of the internet has increased exponentially, not just to access information, but also the actual opportunities of interacting with that information and accessing different levels of political making and participating one way or another, even if it is just by giving comments through social media, even if it is just by putting pressure in those ways. It's the transformation of who has control over our information that is transacted between in politics is not between traditional institutions like the traditional print media or broadcasting and institutions. It's much more wider than that, and that again messes up that delegation chain we are used to look at in terms of representative mandate. And then finally, the expansion of participatory democracy. I mean, this started obviously very much in the 1970s, more as a utopia, more as ideas. But really, since the 1990s, you actually see this put into practice. And there's lots and lots of different examples throughout the world of participatory tools being developed. Some of them integrated with government and parliamentary institutions, only very few still. Most of them in parallel to that. But there's more and more, increasingly, those participatory tools and participatory experiments, particularly at the local level, local government level. And of course, the most well-known case is the case of the participatory budget in Porto Alegre in Brazil, where the citizens themselves, the public themselves, have been able for a long time to actually have an input into what the budget should be for the town. And that's an example that has been now reproduced in lots of different ways. So we may focus on Parliament, we may focus on representatives and what they do in Parliament, but we should not ignore this huge development happening elsewhere, and we should not ignore the thought of how does that fit with what Parliament does and with representation and with a representative mandate. So with these key changes, what they show is that our society has changed. We still look very much a representative framework from the institutions set up in the 19th century, but in reality our society is very different today, our public is very different, and the institutions themselves are developing and expanding in a way that doesn't necessarily fit into the institutional framework that we used to think about. And we definitely, in parliamentary studies and legislative studies, need to rethink about this and think, how does it all fit? So one of my arguments is that we've moved from a gentleman's club in the 19th century to a representative club in the 20th century, and then towards the end of the 20th century into the 21st century to a mediator parliament. So what do I mean by that? I mean, with a gentleman's club parliament, it was very much a parliament elected by a limited franchise. Not everyone could vote. Most of the people in Parliament were probably also the people in government. There isn't very much a participation or link with the society. Then with the expansion of the universal franchise and the development of the mass parties in the 20th century, we develop into the representative parliament, where the representative chain becomes very important, the representative link between the parties or the MPs and the citizens. And then finally, towards the end of the 20th century, when participatory democracy starts developing and our societies develops more into the advanced industrial societies that we have today, we develop into the mediator parliament. And the mediator parliament is a parliament that performs a very important function of mediating between citizens and governments. But it's also a parliament where, more realistically, it doesn't necessarily have a very active role in actually changing policy. It's more in terms of scrutinising and legitimising the political system, but scrutinising what government does with a variety of different institutions linked to that. And so there's a shift in there, 3 different types of parliaments. And to better understand representation in this context, in my view, we need to understand much better how participatory democracy, participatory tools integrate with representative. Until we solve this paradox, this I don't actually see it as a contradiction, but these two different types of phenomena happening until we see how can one integrate into the other one, then we haven't really moved on beyond the way we looked at parliamentary representation in the 20th century. And there's plenty of tools happening out there. The Brazilian parliament has quite a few tools where it integrates participation from citizens into the policy making. Even the UK parliament has experimented with these, and there's plenty more examples. But we tend to ignore those. In my view also, we should pay much more attention to symbolic representation. We often use, as academics in parliament, working on parliamentary representation in parliaments, we use Pitkin fourfold conceptualization of representation, and we tend to focus very much on descriptive and substantive representation. And then we ignore, really, to a large extent, the symbolic representation. And in an era where we all have very individualistic interests, very particularistic interests, where it's much more difficult to aggregate our interests, and where it's much more volatile, to look at symbolic representation as a way of saying what is it that links people to the institutions, what is it that makes people identify with those institutions, is very much an important side of representation today, and I would argue more so today than it has ever been before. And from that point of view, I think that we, in legislative studies, parliamentary studies, we should pay more attention to some of the more modern conceptualization representations that have been developed by political theorists. And I'm referring in particular to people like Michael Salward and his concept of the representative claim, or people like David Runciman were looking at representations as identity. And I think if we, from our own point of view, parliamentary studies, if we use more those tools and use them and integrate it to what we know about parliamentary representation, then we will have a much more complete way of looking at representation, and a much more apt to the 21st century. So I'm sorry that this was sort of running through lots of different ideas, and I hope it made some sense. I've done all this in one go, so I hope it does make some sense, and I really wish you all the best. I really wish I was there. And if anyone's got any comments to the paper that I've circulated through Elena, then please, by all means, do get in touch with me. And I hope to see you sometime. Thank you. Bye-bye.